The German population on the home front have begun to notice the full impact of the war by now. In order to break their resolve, the British use a strategy they call moral bombing, attacking residential areas and city centers. The ensuing chaos, however, facilitates the Nazi authorities' deportation plans for Jews.
The area bombings are of course not the only reason for the persecution of Jews or for the establishment of extermination camps. But with the bombings, the notion of the deportation of Jews gained popularity among the local authorities. So the pressure from below grew. Get them off our backs and make sure they never return. When you look at the bulk of those transports, they came from Hamburg, from the Rhine-Ruhr area, as well as from Bremen, Bremerhaven, Emden and so forth. The Jews were taken away from the bombed areas, and that meant more housing became available, and also, more importantly, household equipment and clothing, to the effect that German families that had suffered from the bombings received a kind of unbureaucratic emergency relief.
The person responsible for organizing the genocide is the head of the Reich Main Security Office and Deputy Reichsprotektor or Governor in Prague, Reinhard Heydrich. On the 27th of May 1942, Czech soldiers returning from exile make an attempt on Heydrich's life, who dies in hospital a few days later. The retaliation of the SS is horrific. On the 10th of June, Lidice, a village near Prague, is burned and leveled on suspicion that the assassins have been hiding here. All 172 men from the village are executed. Women and children deported to concentration camps. The propaganda plays down the negative aspects of the war. Here, wounded soldiers are entertained in Munich. Only the supreme commanders know the extent of decimation the German war machinery has suffered. Over 1 million soldiers from the Russian campaign are dead, missing or captured.
Most people were extremely realistic. 1942 saw a rapid decrease in the numbers of life insurances and mortgages taken out. The regime promoted the so-called Iron Savings Plan, which gave savers exemption from both taxation and social security contributions, as well as a yield of between 15% and 20%. The catch, however, was that the maturity was linked to the day of the final victory in the war, so no one was prepared to do it. The only people who took out this savings plan were those working in the public sector or in National Socialist organizations, and only because there was collective pressure on them to do so.
Oil, rather than the conquest of Lebensraum in the East, is now the most important war objective, professes Hitler after the launch of the 1942 summer offensive against the Red Army. If I don't secure the oil from the fields of Maikop and Grozny, I will have to liquidate this war. He sweeps aside any criticism from his generals, claiming that only his steadfastness had prevented a Napoleonic disaster. This war was not simply about victory or defeat, but over triumph or downfall. The Wehrmacht amasses all its forces for an offensive in southern Russia. The German troops break the Soviet front at some places, and smaller units even manage to take the oil fields of Maikop. But it is not enough for the desperately needed supplies. The Germans no longer show any kind of respect for the civilian population. If they encounter any resistance, they burn down entire villages and execute civilians under the pretense that they are partisans. The occupied areas are ruthlessly pillaged. Despite the fact that seized produce and foodstuffs are being sent back to Germany by the wagon load, the supply on the home front is on the verge of collapse.
Hitler was consistently opposed to any burdens being imposed on Germans. During a famous meeting with Hermann Göring in August 1942, he said that the exploitation of the occupied territories for the benefit of the German people had to be doubled, meaning that both the food quotas and the amount of commodities taken from there had to be increased drastically in order to maintain stability at home and not lead to another 1918 in Germany.
An unknown military physician documents the gruesome reality of the war in an army hospital near Bielefeld. Even amputee Wehrmacht soldiers are to be made fit for action here, either in the war or on the home front. With supplies and reinforcements being stalled, the war in North Africa too turns into a disaster for the Germans. The British forces, which now outnumber the Germans, defeat Field Marshal Rommel in El Alamein. Rommel's orders to his army to retreat infuriate Hitler. "You can show your troops no other way than that which leads to victory or death," reads the dictator's radio message. Hitler issues an arrest warrant for Rommel, which is never carried out. Despite his defeat, the propaganda celebrates the field marshal as a hero, yet Rommel distances himself more and more from the Führer. On several occasions he voices his opinion that final victory is unattainable. On the 23rd of November 1942, the German 6th Army under General Paulus becomes encircled in Stalingrad. Thanks to armaments supplied by the Western Allies, the Red Army can keep the Germans in check. Hitler decrees to hold the positions in Stalingrad under all circumstances, which results in a bitter battle over the city on the Volga River. The supply of the troops from the air is totally insufficient. In Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht finally loses the aura of invincibility that had surrounded it.
By the autumn of 1942, German troops were embroiled in Stalingrad, and of course over the next months this became huge, enormous and decisive defeat for Germany. The crucial point perhaps to add to this with regard to the German offensive is that the Wehrmacht was actually substantially weaker in 1942 than it had been in 1941. Germans had lost almost 1 million men in the meanwhile. Realistically, the victory, the final victory as envisaged in 1940-41 was no longer possible. But from Hitler's perspective, it still looked as if victory could be attained at that point.
In the Wolf's Lair, the Führer's military headquarters in East Prussia, Hitler receives the Romanian dictator Ion Antonescu on the 10th of January 1943. The Führer holds his Romanian and Italian allies jointly responsible for the situation in Russia. His generals are ordered to hold Stalingrad to the last man. The fact that the troops in Stalingrad have been surrounded for weeks is kept secret from the German public on Hitler's orders. A reception on Hermann Göring's 50th birthday on the 19th of January. The Reichsmarschall has promised against his better judgment to supply the enclosed troops in Stalingrad from the air. And although Göring is no longer taken particularly seriously after the failure of his air force, he still manages to impress Hitler with empty promises time and again. The 6th Army surrenders on the 31st of January. "Shaken and broken, our people behold the loss of the men of Stalingrad," reads a leaflet distributed in February by the resistance group White Rose. Do we want to sacrifice the rest of German youth to the base ambitions of a party clique? No, never. The courageous students around Sophie and Hans Scholl are arrested and executed before the month is over. Friedrich Paulus, the commander of the Sixth Army, during an interrogation by the Russians. One day before the capitulation, Hitler had promoted Paulus to field marshal, an invitation to commit suicide in the face of defeat.
Stalingrad was an immense defeat, and the entire Sixth Army was lost. Hitler himself, it could not be concealed, had actually stood behind this German defeat in Stalingrad. And so for the first time now, the German population blamed Hitler personally. They were very careful how they expressed it, but it was clear the blame was being attached to Hitler personally now for the defeat in Stalingrad. And so the Hitler myth was now punctured decisively. It was a key moment in the decline of the myth that had surrounded Hitler, this myth of infallibility that he had been, when everybody else was making mistakes, the military or the rest of the leadership, Hitler was still untouchable. No longer after Stalingrad was that the case.
Even though Berchtesgaden is not yet within the operating range of Allied bombers, air raid precautions are taken at Obersalzberg. Hitler personally watches an exercise in the spring of 1943. He now spends more and more time in his mountainside retreat.
He was used to winning all the battles he fought, because until then everything had gone so well for him. He was sure that he was the savior of the German nation, and believed that the German people would attain victory with him as their leader. And because of all the successful campaigns he had led, he felt vindicated in his role as a savior. The great shock came when the victories on the battlefield ended, and it was then that he started to fall apart.
Hitler confides in Joseph Goebbels that the fall of the Third Reich could be brought about only through the weakness of the populace. If the German people was to be obliterated by a stronger nation, then one could feel no pity for it. On the 8th of February at Berlin's Sportpalast, the propaganda minister delivers his famous Total War speech.
Das deutsche Volk wehrt sich gegen die totalen Kriegsmaßnahmen der Regierung. Es will nicht den totalen Krieg, sagen die Engländer, sondern die Kapitulation. Wollt ihr den totalen Krieg? Wollt ihr ihn, wenn nötig, totaler und radikaler, als wir ihn für uns heute überhaupt erst vorstellen können?
I will certainly see to it that this is a total war, not only on paper, Goebbels writes in his diary. In the style of Europe's economic dictator, the new Reich Armaments Minister Albert Speer tries to secure supplies for both the front and the home territories. In an attempt to compensate for the shortage in labor force, Speer decrees the compulsory recruitment of workers in occupied areas, including concentration camp inmates, to work as slave laborers in the arms industry. Here, for the newsreel, the minister presents the latest developments in German weapons technology. Despite the short supply of raw materials, Speer intermittently manages to raise the production numbers in all sectors. During this stage of the war, there is an increased demand for anti-aircraft guns, as the flying fortresses of the US Air Force have now started to engage in air raids over Germany. German armament plants are the #1 targets of the American bombers, while the British concentrate on the destruction of entire cities in Nazi Germany. For some time, German anti-aircraft artillery and night fighters succeed in shooting down many bombers. Hundreds of Allied pilots and crew members are lynched by enraged crowds with the consent of the Nazi leadership. Yet more and more bombers reach their targets and drop their deadly load unhindered. The scenes are always the same, whether in Berlin, Cologne or Leipzig. Firemen try to put out the fires, helpers recover the dead. People try to save what can be saved. The helpless reaction of the authorities raises more and more voices of criticism, but no opposition makes itself felt.
It's important to understand that every totalitarian rule, but especially this National Socialist regime, aims to destroy the settings where public opinion can be formed. There was no press, there were no organizations, and all associations and societies were transferred into the hands of the party and organized accordingly. There were no places in which the opposition, which undoubtedly existed, public discontent, or people with the conviction that it would all end horribly, could become organized and gain a voice.
For a long time now, Hitler's opponents in the Wehrmacht have had no doubts that the Führer must die for the war and the killing to end. Young officers plan to assassinate the dictator during a visit to the troops in Smolensk, but their general stops them because Chief of SS Himmler is not present. Instead, Hitler is cheered by his troops and the propaganda machine records the event. The dictator's visits to the Reich capital are sporadic, so his public appearance at the Memorial Day celebrations is a rare opportunity for the opposition in the army to undertake another assassination attempt. The plan fails because Hitler leaves the Zeughaus, the armory, too early, and the determined officers miss their chance. Za Granica, Abroad, is the title of a German propaganda film shown in Poland with the aim to draw labor forces to Germany. The footage is filmed in the production halls of the car plant in the city of KDF Wagen, where the first Volkswagen Beetles were manufactured before the war. The workers are led to believe that the conditions will be blissful, with excellent boarding, first-rate medical care, good pay and frequent holidays at home. In the small village of Steindorf in Pomerania, an amateur filmmaker documents the brutal reality. When German girls become involved with foreign workers, the populace shows no pity and pillories the guilty parties publicly. During the last week of July 1943, hundreds of RAF bombers fly several night raids over Hamburg. The bombs create a horrific firestorm. Entire city districts are consumed within hours. People are engulfed in the huge inferno. The tornadic fire incinerates everything in its way. Fireman Hans Brunswig shoots this footage with the consent of the authorities for documentation purposes. Over 35,000 people are killed during the so-called Operation Gomorrah, but the Allied attacks cannot break the spirit of the survivors.
People in Hamburg had hardly slept through a single night since 1940. They were totally shattered, even more so after those huge raids in the summer of 1943. So resistance to the regime is not a top priority here. In a situation as bad as this, the people's interests are reduced to an individual level. A kind of loyal apathy develops, which arises from the lack of alternatives. One either doesn't recognize the paths that lead to a change, or perceives them as being blocked. Also, with the war against the Soviet Union, the regime had already defined its own path. There's no turning back. There is only victory or defeat, and if we are defeated, we will all die, and with us a large section of the Germans.
In the summer of 1943, Heinrich Himmler visits the top-secret Army Research Center in Peenemünde. The Reichsführer SS has professed his interest in the A4 rocket for some time and wants to see the developments for himself. The trial results still leave much to be desired, but the Nazi leadership has high hopes that the Wunderwaffe will soon be operational and promises the population devastating retaliation strikes against British cities. The Führer wants to halt the Soviet advances on the Eastern Front with a colossal demonstration of power near Kursk. According to his calculations, Operation Citadel is to be a formidable offensive and the comeback of his army in the east, which would also serve to unnerve the Western Allies. But these plans proved to be totally unrealistic. 700,000 Wehrmacht forces storm in vain against the layered Red Army defenses, for the German offensive lacks any strategic planning. Hitler finally calls off the pointless operation. From this point on, the Red Army takes the initiative, and the Wehrmacht finds itself in retreat.
München am Vorabend des 9. November. Unter dem stürmischen Jubel seiner alten Garde trifft der Führer im Löwenbräu-Keller ein. Herzlich begrüßt er seine treuen Mitkämpfer aus den ersten Anfängen der Bewegung. In seiner Rede rechnet Adolf Hitler mit den Feinden Deutschlands ab. In ihrer Verblendung hatten sie für den November 1943 einen Zusammenbruch des Reiches wie im Jahre 1918 prophezeit. Aber sie haben sich geirrt. Der Führer sagte weiter: Deutsches Volk, sei völlig beruhigt. Was auch kommen mag, wir werden es meistern. Am Ende steht der Sieg.
The worst of all is that he never came face to face with the hardship of the German people. He travelled across Germany in his special trains, and when he passed through cities, he would draw the curtains. He didn't want to see Germany's cities in ruins. It was like a self-protection mechanism, which sometimes must have helped him to make himself believe that the final victory was near. But these promises and speeches were more for the benefit of his audiences. He couldn't really have believed it himself.
At Stalin's command, the Red Army launches a large-scale offensive against the Army Group North on the 14th of January. Within a few weeks, the Soviet troops managed to liberate Leningrad after 900 days under German siege. Despite the increasingly hopeless situation, Hitler rejects a strategic retreat of the Wehrmacht, sticking to his hold or die maxim. The result is that both sides suffer severe losses, and large numbers of German soldiers are captured by the Soviets. The dictator knows that the troops of the Western Allies in Britain will eventually try to land in northern France, and orders all available units to deploy for the defense of the so-called Atlantic Wall. This footage is filmed by a cameraman of the Sturmgeschützabteilung, Assault Gun Battalion 200, in January 1944. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, during an inspection of the troops. Although his campaign in North Africa did not furnish the expected success, the Desert Fox is regarded as a gifted commander and is given the mission of coordinating forces in Normandy. The Führer expects an invasion at the narrowest point of the channel near Calais, so the Germans have stationed over 100,000 men in Normandy. The recent defeats don't fail to make an impression on the allies of the Nazis. On the 18th of March 1944, Hitler accuses Hungary's regent, Admiral Horthy, of conducting secret negotiations with the Allies, as well as of allowing nearly 1 million Jews to live in freedom in his country. Horthy is asked to immediately invite the Wehrmacht into unoccupied Hungary. The regent accedes to the pressure and returns to Budapest accompanied by high-ranking SS officials. The Wehrmacht occupies Budapest. German propaganda proclaims the occupation to serve only the security of the country. 1 month later, the deportations of Hungarian Jews to the extermination camps begin. In a period of just 2 months, 400,000 people are murdered in Auschwitz. Adolf Eichmann, the man responsible for the logistics in the Reich's main security office, organizes the transportation of Jews all across Europe. The relevant ministries in Berlin are happy to offer administrative assistance. The only known film footage of one such transport is filmed in the Westerbork concentration camp in Holland in 1944. The film was commissioned by the commanding officer himself. On arrival in Auschwitz, approximately 2/3 of the prisoners are murdered immediately, and the rest are sent to work as slave laborers in Poland or in the Third Reich.
The selection of people fit to work was intensified again. It goes without saying that those fit to work were also to die after they had done their work. But due to the fact that they were selected to become laborers, they were at least given a chance to survive for some time.
Reichskanzlei tragen sich mit den Vertretern der diplomatischen Missionen Männer, Frauen und Jugendliche aus allen Schichten des Volkes in die Gratulationslisten ein.
For the first time, the celebrations for the Führer's birthday, his 55th, take place without him.
Wenn wir uns ein ganzes Jahr durch unseren Fleiß und durch unsere Tapferkeit zum Werke des Führers bekennen, dann wollen wir uns an seinem Geburtstag einmal auch in Worten, die aus der Tiefe unserer Herzen kommen, zu seiner Person bekennen dürfen. Wünschen wollen wir ihm Gesundheit und Kraft und vor allem eine gesegnete Hand. Wissen soll er zu jeder Stunde, dass er sich auf sein Volk verlassen kann. Auch in diesem Kampfe auf Leben und Tod ist und bleibt er uns das, was er uns immer war. Unser Hitler.
On the occasion of the celebrations, Goebbels has Berlin decorated with flags and slogans, brimming with pathos. Our walls are broken, but not our hearts. The party newspaper Völkischer Beobachter writes, "Never before has the German people looked up to its leader as trustingly as in these hours, as he has become aware of the whole extent of this struggle for our lives." On the 3rd of June 1944, Eva Braun's sister Gretel marries SS-Gruppenführer Hermann Fegelein in Salzburg. Fegelein was the commander of a SS cavalry division in the East and has the lives of tens of thousands of civilians on his conscience. The celebration is held on the Berghof. It is the last party that Hitler's lover will organize in the mountain residence. The group portrait shows the bride and groom with Hitler. The 6th of June 1944 is to become the longest day of World War II. The landings in Normandy commence at dawn. Suffering heavy casualties, the Allied forces storm the French coast along an 80-kilometer stretch. At the Omaha Beach section, the Americans encounter fierce resistance. Machine guns mow down the charging soldiers in their hundreds.
An invasion was expected, and expected imminently, but the German High Command of the Wehrmacht was unsure precisely where this invasion would take place. Hitler himself had actually thought that it would take place in Normandy, or so he later said. But only in one of the 4 beaches in which the Allies landed in Normandy were German troops at the ready, and that was Omaha Beach, where there was a very tough fighting by the Americans with huge numbers of casualties on the first day of the fighting. But even there, at the end of this longest day of the Second World War, the landing had been secured, and Hitler himself, even after the landing had been secured, was still optimistic that the invasion could be repulsed. Until then, he'd been absolutely adamant that the invasion, he was waiting for the invasion, because when the invasion took place, it would be repelled.
10,000 Allied soldiers are killed or wounded on D-Day. "Now we finally have them where we can beat them," comments Hitler when he hears the news of the landing. By the evening of the first day, the Allied forces have managed to establish several bridgeheads in France. From this point on, the assault on Fortress Europe will be unstoppable. At the Wehrmacht High Command in Mauerwald, East Prussia, officers while away their time by making a film that documents the daily routine of the General Staff. Meanwhile, the Führer's military headquarters in the nearby Wolf's Lair is moved into a bomb-proof fortification during Hitler's absence. The dictator and his entourage do not return to East Prussia until mid-July. On the afternoon of the 20th of July, Hitler welcomes Benito Mussolini at the railway station of the Wolf's Lair complex. Just a few hours earlier, the Führer had survived an assassination attempt by means of a briefcase bomb during the daily strategy meeting. The propaganda minister describes the scenery in the demolished barracks on the radio.
Im ganzen Raum gab es nur eine einzige Stelle innerhalb der enormen Detonationswelle, die davon verhältnismäßig unberührt blieb. Und das war die, an der der Führer am Kartentisch saß. Teilnehmer der Besprechung sind durch die Kraft der Explosion viele Meter weit aus dem Fenster herausgeschleudert worden. Ich kann nur sagen, dass, wenn die Errettung des Führers aus höchster Lebensgefahr kein Wunder war, es überhaupt keine Wunder mehr gibt.
What he never envisaged was a strike from within his own armed forces leadership. So for Hitler, this was something which was just an extraordinary blow, and he responded as he only would with enormous ruthlessness and brutality. This was a stab in the back from within the armed forces leadership. It left within him now a very pronounced sense of betrayal, of treason from within, an obsession with this treason from within. It provided him with the alibi, of course, for why everything had gone wrong. So now he was able to blame everything, the collapse of the Eastern Front, the success of the invasion of the West, whatever, on the people around him who'd been perpetrating treason. And this sense of intense distrust and obsession with treason from within remained with him to the very end.
2 Wochen nach der Tat verhandelt der Volksgerichtshof gegen 8 der aus dem Heere ausgestoßenen Verräter, die an dem Verbrechen des 20. Juli führend beteiligt waren.
After the failure of the coup d'etat, the plot leaders around Graf von Stauffenberg are court-martialed and executed by a firing squad on the same night. Hitler has the surviving conspirators relentlessly rounded up and sentenced to death in show trials before his blood judge, Roland Freisler. One of them is Ulrich Graf Schwerin von Schwanenfeld.
Morde? Sie sind ja ein schäbiger Lump! Brechen Sie unter der Gemeinheit! Ja oder nein? Zerbrechen Sie darunter?
Herr Präsident, auf meinem...
Ja oder nein auf eine klare Antwort?
Nein.
Nein, Sie können auch nicht mehr zerbrechen. Denn Sie sind ja nur noch ein Häufchen Elend, das vor sich keine Achtung mehr hat.
The heroes of the 20th of July, as we call them today, were the traitors in those trials, which were all filmed for the newsreel. But Freisler's behavior was so out of line during the trial that Goebbels realized it wouldn't be good for the propaganda. In order for the trials to be effective for propaganda purposes, he would have preferred a different, fairer atmosphere during the proceedings.
Im Namen des deutschen Volkes,
Ehrgeiz-zerfressene, ehrlose, feige Verräter, statt mannhaft wie das ganze deutsche Volk, dem Führer folgend, unseren Sieg zu erkämpfen, verrieten sie das Opfer unserer Krieger, Volk, Führer und Reich. Sie werden mit dem Tode bestraft.
The People's Court condemns over 100 defendants to death by hanging and another 30 to prison sentences. Along with many political prisoners, the Brandenburg-Görden Penitentiary also houses normal citizens who have publicly raised doubts on the final victory. The Nazi judicial system proceeds mercilessly against any form of opposition.
Of all the death sentences imposed on Germans by the People's Court, 95% were handed out in the years 1943 to 44. As a result, political debate in public was practically silenced. In this respect, the Nazi propaganda was successful, inasmuch as it managed to restrain people from speaking out.
A mass funeral for the dead after a bombing raid in Nordenham, a town at the mouth of the Weser River. The phrase, "died for the Führer, the people and the fatherland," appears less and less often in obituaries. If one receives such blows, only an idiot can believe that the war will be won, reasons a citizen in Berlin, according to a confidential report. Despite the fact that the bomb damage in plants contributing to the war effort is often patched up within hours and the factories can manufacture again soon, Armaments Minister Albert Speer has long lost the race against the Allies. In 1944 alone, the Americans built as many aircraft as Germany had produced over the course of the entire war. The wonder weapons promised by the propaganda, such as the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter here, may be deployed in operational service in isolated cases, but cannot win back the air supremacy from the Allied air forces. And also Hitler's rockets from Peenemünde failed to halt the advance of the Allies. The Reich Plenipotentiary for Total War, Joseph Goebbels, must now mobilize the last reserves on the home front. Anyone who is capable of carrying a gun is conscripted for the Volkssturm.
I've read many diaries from that time, 43, 44, 45, and what stands out is that people didn't actually criticize Hitler himself, but the people in his environment. Göring in particular was very unpopular, but many people couldn't stand Goebbels either. They don't let our Führer get back on his feet, people wrote. And because by then Hitler had practically withdrawn from public life, people were more prepared to forgive him. Then at some point around the end of 1944, a rumor started going around that Hitler was no longer alive.
Armaments Minister Albert Speer visits the deployment zone of the Ardennes offensive. In mid-December 1944, the Wehrmacht had mobilized all remaining reserves and launched Operation Autumn Mist. The low point had been overcome, declared the dictator at the turn of the year from his headquarters in Bad Nauheim. Ultimately, the Reich would be victorious. An unknown filmmaker captures these seemingly carefree scenes at an anti-aircraft artillery position somewhere in the south of Germany. Women, adolescents, and men unfit for the front are the last contingent the Nazi leaders can muster. They are to halt the waves of Allied bombers which by now enter the German airspace almost unhindered. British and US forces intensify the air raids over Germany once again. The list of targets grow longer, and even smaller towns with no apparent strategic significance are leveled. Within the space of a few weeks, massive destruction is wreaked on German cities. On the 3rd of February 1945, 1,000 American bombers fly a large raid on Berlin. Some 3,000 people are killed during Operation Thunderclap, and over 120,000 become homeless. And although cities like Dresden, Potsdam, Würzburg or Pforzheim are almost completely destroyed, the people continue to stick it out, for many cannot imagine a future without Hitler.
On the one hand, we have the fear of defeat, especially after everything people had learned about the crimes committed by Germans, and about how the conquered and the discriminated peoples have been treated, in particular the Jews. They were effectively frightened. Then we have the propaganda saying that subhumans are invading the German Reich, meaning the Russians from the east, combined with some real reports about the conduct of Red Army units in the cities they had taken.
The 13th of January marks the beginning of the major Red Army offensive in East Prussia. The depleted Wehrmacht divisions cannot halt the superior Soviet forces. Many refugee treks out of East Prussia are wiped out by the Red Army. The amount of guilt Hitler has incurred is enormous, a soldier writes, and continues, "If I can't see my family again, then I don't want to live anymore." Red Army units liberate Auschwitz, Hitler's death factory in Poland, on the 27th of January 1945. Only about 7,000 inmates remain alive in the camp. Sick people and children who have been subjugated to medical experiments. Nearly 6 million Jews were methodically murdered in the extermination camps. Men, women, and over 1.5 million children, shot by death squads, gassed, poisoned, or beaten to death. They are the victims of the most heinous crime against humanity, organized and carried out in the name of the German people. On the Western Front, too, the war comes into Germany. On the 6th of March, American troops advanced into the center of Cologne. The Nazi functionaries want to defend the city to the last man alive. US Army camera crews capture the dramatic scenes showing house-to-house fighting at first hand. At 5 p.m. local time, the battle for Cologne is over. American forces reach the bank of the Rhine River. On the 20th of March, Hitler appears for the last time before the newsreel cameras in the garden of the Chancellery of the Reich. He wants Germany to go down with him.
Hitler had said on a number of occasions, if this war is lost, it will be because the German people is not strong enough. And if that is the case, it deserves to go under, it deserves to suffer defeat. Hitler has said, if we go down, we'll take a world with us. So this was Hitler's mentality there, that if there were to be no successful outcome to this war for Germany, then it would be with total destruction within Germany as well as without. He would take his enemies down with him into the abyss, and the German people would have no need for any provisions, and therefore everything within Germany could be destroyed.
Having crossed the Rhine, British and US troops continue to advance eastward. Hitler is surprised that the Western Front has collapsed so soon. He senses treason. Many Wehrmacht units surrender much too quickly. The spell that had held the soldiers bound to him for years is now completely broken, especially here, far away from his remaining sphere of power. The atrocities can no longer be concealed. In early April 1945, US soldiers liberate the Ohrdruf concentration camp in Thuringia. Some 10,000 slave laborers had been locked up here. Only a few survived the Nazi barbarity. The Americans are shocked. Ohrdruf is one of the first camps they have set eyes on. On orders from the victors, the reluctant residents of the nearby village are confronted with the gruesome truth. The advancing Red Army has concentrated 500,000 soldiers along the Oder River. On the 16th of April, the Soviets launched the offensive on Berlin. House-to-house fighting rages in the streets of the capital. Despite fierce resistance, the Soviets take one district after another and advance toward the city center. Hitler has withdrawn to his underground bunker below the Reich Chancellery. He orders troop units that no longer exist or are too far away to intervene to push forward. Even in this desperate situation, capitulation is out of the question for the Führer, and thus tens of thousands of soldiers from both sides, as well as countless civilians, must die in the streets of Berlin.
At the very end, we only know effectively that he was now resigned to his fate, that he had, in a sense, prepared this ending, which was almost a theatrical end to the Third Reich, with his own suicide now, with the Russians almost literally at the very doors, and again with the notion that, which was put out by propaganda then, that the Führer had fallen with his troops, which of course a last lie, fallen with his troops at the very end. Again, a portrayal of this image of heroic leadership to the very end, the image that he wanted to be that which would outlast him and go into posterity as the image of heroism surviving to the very end, unlike 1918, not following the coward way out of capitulation, but fighting heroically on to the bitter end.
The dictator marries Eva Braun in the Führer bunker. On the 30th of April 1945 at 3:30 in the afternoon, the newlyweds retreat to Hitler's private chambers and commit suicide. Joseph Goebbels assumes the task of organizing the end of the Nazi rule. Two days later, the forces defending Berlin surrender. The victors seize the center of power of the Third Reich. On the 3rd of May, the corpses of Joseph Goebbels and his family are lined up in the garden of Plötzensee prison, while Soviet cameras roll. The Goebbels family, that would not even spare their own children, are made a symbol of a deadly fanaticism which in the end claimed the lives of 60 million people. On the 30th of January 1933, a cheering crowd of Hitler's followers marched through Brandenburg Gate holding torches after his appointment as Reich Chancellor. 12 years, 3 months and 9 days later, everything is over. Germany lies in ruins, occupied and soon to be divided. High-ranking Nazis commit suicide or surrender to the victors. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring believes he may have a political future, but is arrested and put on trial. Just like many other Nazis, he is unaware of any wrongdoing. The final act takes place on the 8th of May in the Berlin bureau of Karlshorst. It is incumbent upon the military leaders to formally end the Nazi rule over Germany and half of Europe. In the presence of army commanders of the victorious Allied powers, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signs the capitulation of the German armed forces on land, at sea and in the air shortly after midnight. At exactly 11:01 p.m., the guns had fallen silent on all fronts. The Second World War is over. The Third Reich has ceased to exist.